I'm Sheila Guillotone, and this is the Simsbury Woman. Today we're going to explore the history of conservation in America, but from the perspective detailed in a new book by author Bibi Gaston. The book, Gifford Pinchot and the Old Timers, recounts the story of 225 individuals, men and women who worked to protect and preserve the natural resources of this great country. Bibi is my guest today, and she will tell you how she found the actual letters written by these individuals in the Pinchot collection at the Library of Congress. It's like a mystery adventure. Bibi discovered 5 boxes simply labeled the Old Timers. But Old Timers is not a pejorative term, quite the opposite. As she read the letters, she began to learn how these dedicated individuals, inspired by Gifford Pinchot, created the U.S. Forest Service. Welcome, Bibi.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Tell us a little bit first, before we start, about the actual letters, about how you got interested in conservation.
Well, I'm a landscape architect.
Okay.
As a trained landscape architect, and for 25 years before I stumbled into these letters, I was writing the book on my grandmother, Roosevelt and Pinchot, the loveliest woman in America, which came out in 2008.
As I understand it, you're actually a descendant of the Pinchots somehow, right?
That's right. Gifford was my great-grand-uncle. So his brother was my great-grandfather.
Okay.
Amos Pinchot.
Okay.
So I was doing some work on the book on my grandmother, finding out more and more about her incredible life, Rosamond, and Gifford's niece, when I stumbled into these letters. And there are 2 million documents at the Library of Congress Pinchot collection.
Wow.
So it's one of the, perhaps the 3rd largest collection. At one point it was the 2nd. I think it might have migrated down to 3rd or 4th by now, but it is massive. Those are personal papers, but most of what's in them are also governmental papers. So, so there was a subset, these 5 blue boxes.
So now where are you? In the Library of Congress? I picture you in the basement with cobwebs and...
I'm actually, I think I'm in the Madison building, which is where the manuscript division is, and where the Pinchot collection is. And so it incorporates Gifford, Amos Pinchot, Rosamond, and Cornelia Pinchot, who was the governor's wife.
Okay. So Gifford was born in Simsbury.
Yes.
Right? And then at some point became governor of Pennsylvania?
That's right.
Correct?
He had 2 terms as Republican governor of Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And he was born in 1865 at what is now the 1820 house.
Really?
Right on Main Street.
Okay.
Yes.
And I noticed in looking through some of the stuff that you'd written, there was an Eno person mentioned. And of course, we're in Eno Hall.
You're in Eno.
Now.
We are. We're in Eno Hall.
Oh, there's so much history here.
I know. It's an amazing thing. So Mary Jane Eno was Gifford's mother. Oh. And she came from a long line of New Yorkers. Okay. So yes, they owned the house.
Okay.
Yes.
Very cool.
The 1820 house.
Okay, so let's get back to the Library of Congress.
Okay.
So you're researching the Pinchot collection, which is basically what kind of documents?
Well, it's everything ranging from the governor's political papers to personal, let's say, note cards and recipes and manuscripts and appointment calendars of the governor's wife. Okay. Everything is in this collection. Okay. It's, as I said, it's huge. Yeah. So anything you look for, and there are quite a few. There are lots and lots of people who corresponded with all of the Pinchots. Yeah. So it's a bottomless pit of information and fascinating connections. Okay.
So you find these blue boxes. What do the blue boxes look like?
Well, they were just file boxes that were vertical, and they were setting aside because the manuscript librarian had set them aside as a special collection. And I didn't count the number of pages in them, but I just noticed it was a lot. But I'd photographed, I may be getting ahead of myself here, but I photographed perhaps maybe 30 or 40 pages at the first go-round. there were 5,000 pages
geez.
of letters.
Wow.
225 individual
Okay, so these are
correspondence.
and this is probably going off on a tangent, but I noticed in your introduction, I mean, you talk about the introduction to the book, you talk about the men and women. Were there women actually involved? Were some of the letters from women?
Yes, they were.
Wow.
And the Governor Gifford Pinchot was very much ahead of his time, and he insisted that the forest rangers turn to their wives and say, you must submit a narrative, which was wonderful of him and quite revealing. But that wasn't just the wives, it was also women, young women, generally speaking, who had volunteered, I say volunteered, but had actually taken the civil service exam and joined the Forest Service, usually as stenographer typists.
Okay.
There were also men who joined as stenographer typists.
Okay.
But this was one way to attain employment with the government
Okay.
in these early years.
Yeah, so the country's developing, and how did the forest, I mean, Gifford Pinchot is considered the father of conservation, correct?
Yes,
so how did the Forestry Service actually start up in the U.S.? I know where it ended up, I think.
Right. Well, there was a Bureau of Forestry that preceded the official Forest Service. We like to think of the Forest Service as just the Forest Service throughout history, but in fact it was preceded by another government agency called the Bureau of Forestry, and it was.
Of course it did.
Of course.
Politics hasn't
Something
changed
at that.
at all.
Yes,
Right.
that's right. Someone was organizing something.
Okay.
So from 1905 to 1909 is really where the Forest Service begins. The technical forestry begins under Gifford Pinchot and Theodore Roosevelt, who start the division, really to address what they perceived at that time, not just they, but the country perceived as a wood famine. So there was.
Oh, what's a wood famine?
Well, it was a wood shortage. So much of the forest already by that time had been cut down.
Really?
Yes, large swaths of
You're
the
kidding.
east. Oh, yes, most of the eastern forests had been deforested back in 1900. Yes.
When you say the East, I mean, you're talking New
I'm
England,
talking about
Pennsylvania?
all at the Adirondacks, all through much of Minnesota,
Really?
Pennsylvania, down through, for example, Biltmore, where I just gave a
Yeah,
talk.
sure.
Around the Pisgah National Forest had already been deforested by that time. And so
And the reason for that was?
well, just people needed wood. There was these were private corporations, oftentimes, that were
Okay.
given contracts to forest and to cut. So they were needed for houses, for boats,
Right.
for wood, for fire, for everything, just about anything,
Yeah.
furniture. Yes, most of the forest had already been cut down 100 years ago.
Wow, I did not know that.
So Roosevelt and Pinchot come along and say, something needs
This is
to
not
happen
good,
here.
yes. Now, did they know that the rest of this country was out there all the way to California by now?
They sure did. And a lot
Okay.
of the western forest reserves come about as a result of the deforestation in the east.
Okay.
So we don't have a lot of national forests in the east.
No,
We-
I was going to say, aren't most of the national forests in the West?
They are, but there is the green and the white in Vermont and in New Hampshire.
Okay.
There's the Allegheny in Pennsylvania. There's there are some in North Carolina, of course, the Pisgah. So there are quite significant forests in the east, but most of it is in the west.
in the West.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I noticed when I was doing my quick research that California established the first national park.
That's
now, are we
right.
talking about the same thing when we're talking about forests and parks?
That's a really good question. Many people don't really differentiate the two, but I think it becomes increasingly important to know what that difference is. I like to think of the parks as something like a museum because they're safeguarding the beauty of, say, Yosemite or Crater Lake or the High Sierra.
Okay.
There are certain pieces of national park. In any case, but the national forests are really thought of as reserved areas where cutting and use can occur. So and those are permitted uses. So they're really quite different in orientation
Really?
and in description. Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Now, do people, I know they visit national, I don't because I'm not a camper, But I know people visit national parks. Do you visit national forests, or is that a completely different
they're
thing?
very, very highly used, particularly in the West. They serve as almost a backyard playground to major cities now, and they have for quite some time. You have the San Bernardino, which is just adjacent to Los Angeles. You have the Mount Hood and the Gifford Pinchot, which are just adjacent to Portland.
Okay.
So they're de facto parks in many ways, although the Forest Service would never say this is a park.
It's a forest.
It's a forest, and it's a functioning landscape.
Okay.
So it's quite different than the national
Now,
parks.
are those the forests that were getting burned down this year?
Yes, indeed,
Ooh.
indeed. So this creates tremendous amount of stress on the Forest Service, and they are struggling with how to figure out the budget, a lot of the budgetary issues. Because I think it's between half and 2/3 of the budget of the National Forest Service actually goes to firefighting.
Wow.
It's a tremendous number. I don't have the number on the top of my head, but it's been a problem for the forests because the management of the forests become increasingly important during these times of global heating and climate change.
Right.
So forest management has always been part of the objective of the National Forest Service, but it becomes ever more important as these fires, happen.
Now, there are specific things that the National Forest is charged with doing. It seems to me, I recall that water was in there somewhere too.
Yes, the conservation of watersheds, the conservation of water in general becomes one of the primary objectives. I don't know if they would put it in their mission statement, but certainly it was always one of the greatest concerns for Pinchot and Roosevelt. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, well, you're not going to have a forest without water. Obviously. Okay.
That's right. And Pinchot and Roosevelt understood that relationship between trees and water, that trees create their own ecosystem.
Okay.
So where you have trees, and which is why so much of the focus of Pinchot's work was on the planting of trees, because where you have trees, you have the ability to filter water, but also you create cooling and a microclimate that allows for clouds drifting over high points in the forest to be stopped by trees and to create their own humidity.
Really? Now, Pinchot didn't really learn this stuff here. As I understand it, there really weren't any foresters. Is that the correct word? So he studied in Europe.
He did. He went to Nancy in France and studied there, I believe, for almost a year or 2 years. There were virtually no forestry schools in the United States. There was a forestry school down in near Biltmore in Asheville.
Yeah,
but it hadn't.
I've been there. That's really pretty.
Yes. And started by a forester, a German-trained forester named Carl Schenk.
Okay.
But that hadn't really. Schenk and Pinchot were almost the same age.
Okay.
So he went on to Europe to study. He was fortunate enough to have the ability.
And how did he meet Roosevelt? And I was not aware that Roosevelt was so much into conservation.
Well, they came from the same neighborhood.
Okay.
in Lower
That's easy.
I shouldn't say Lower Manhattan, but near Gramercy Park.
Okay.
And so they were neighbors. They were family friends.
Okay.
And so James Pinchot knew everybody in New York. That was Gifford's father.
Okay.
He was truly a man of great civic interests, and he believed very strongly in working towards the public good. So he said to his son, "Thou shalt be a forester."
Really?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
It really kind of worked that way.
Okay, I believe you. I had a maternal grandmother in Ireland, and she had 3 sons, and she said, one will go to university, one will go to the church, and one will be a tradesman. So
There you go.
I do understand.
People were assigned, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah.
Roles.
Yeah. So Roosevelt gets involved, and they decide, when he becomes president, I guess, to actually create a political department?
Yes, a governmental department, and I'm not sure of the actual chartering, but the first department got its start on F Street in Washington, D.C., in a building called the Atlantic Building, which
Okay.
is still there.
Okay.
It's now a J. Crew, I think.
Okay.
But you can see, I mean, that there's a
Right.
terracotta exterior. It's
Yeah.
a beautiful building. And so many of the narratives of the forest range, the early forest rangers that occur in the book, describe the early days of the training that the young men and
Okay.
women received.
Okay, and now it reminds me, you talk about the Baked Apple Club. Tell us about that,
Right.
because that actually sounds kind of like fun.
It does, it does, it does. Well, Gifford Pinchot held meetings at their Rhode Island Avenue home.
In Washington,
in
D.C.
Washington, D.C.
Okay.
I think it's just about 7 blocks from the White House.
Okay.
So he could run over to meet with the president
Okay.
and then come back and meet with the young foresters who were assembled on F Street at the Atlantic Building. And in the evenings, there were these meetings of what was called the Baked Apple Club. And the young foresters who didn't have a lot of money, and they weren't, necessarily from privileged backgrounds. They came from all walks of life, came over and listened to talks on on scientific forestry.
Really?
And that's scientific. So, I mean, Theodore Roosevelt came over and gave what was called a bully talk on conservation.
Really?
Yes, it was wonderful.
Wow.
And they would be fed, the young men and women would be fed baked apples.
Okay.
Served in cream.
Oh, that's nice.
So, yes, and gingerbread.
Yeah.
And, and milk. That was it.
Okay. All right. That sounds good. So now then, were they the people then who went out west and?
Yes.
Okay.
So they would first be assigned to the Atlantic Building, usually if they were in the east. If they were already west, they usually wouldn't come east. But they would eventually, probably, if they stayed with the Forest Service for 20 or 30 years, they would eventually come to the Atlantic Building.
Okay.
So, but from the Atlantic Building, in the Atlantic Building, they would receive their training, and then be dispatched to these far-flung places throughout the country, and that's what so many of the narratives cover, is the on-the-ground experience that they.
So these are letters that the people who've been sent out to do the actual work are sending back to Gifford Pinchot.
Yes, and one thing is that Pinchot very much wanted the history of the Forest Service to be told by the men on the ground.
Oh, that's sweet.
Men and women on the ground.
Really?
And he called these folks the old timers. I don't think it was so much of a slight against historians.
Yeah.
But he said, he gave the credit for the Forest Service to the folks that actually did the work.
Mm-hmm.
And those folks were what he called the old timers, and they knew the struggles, some of the struggles that still exist today.
Yeah.
Between cattlemen and sheepmen.
Sure.
The issues over water and deforestation and the homesteading, so many land-based issues that they had to deal with firsthand.
Sure.
So he knew that they could tell the story unlike anybody else.
So reading those letters is basically understanding what these people were doing and what they were going through and what it took to get forests preserved?
Yes, I would say so. And I think that I think it also gives us a sort of keyhole on the conflicts, or a little view through a keyhole on the conflicts that were alive at the time. And they were, you name it, it was happening out there in the West.
I'm sure.
And there were fires, there were, brand new railroads coming through, there were struggles with with land designations. There were some surveys. There were on-the-ground conflicts with, as I mentioned, homesteaders. So yes, it's a way that we can perceive history, I think, uniquely stated as from the core values of early conservation.
Okay.
So how do we do this?
I don't know. How do we do this?
Yes. How did they do this? Well, they started something. They had a use book which they carried around in their saddlebags, which was written at the Atlantic Building.
Okay.
And the use book was basically, thou shalt do this and thou shalt not do that.
Okay.
And it outlined, it was like a planning document.
Okay.
And so when the foresters stumbled into some issue, they could find the use, they could refer to the use book and say, to the person that might have been doing something, this doesn't work.
Okay.
And this is why.
Okay.
Because most folks weren't used to having any kind of regulation on the ground.
Okay.
No regulation at all. So the forester was an ambassador.
Okay. And of course, they now already had the experience that they had on the East Coast, which was completely foreign to the people who were going out to the virgin forests in the West.
Exactly. And likewise, there were the folks in the West who really didn't understand what was happening in the East.
Right.
And that all these regulations, the use book,
right.
All of these regulations had started.
And they're still fighting against regulations.
They're still fighting against it. But Pinchot and Roosevelt, I think, made a compelling argument, a compelling case that that the resource needed to last for more than 100 years.
Okay.
And that the struggle.
Well, so far, they've just about made it to 100
just about
years.
made it. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. But that the resource was always going to be threatened. But now we find threats from different kinds of angles and origins.
So he and Roosevelt got along very well, but as I understand it, when Taft got elected, things didn't go quite as smoothly.
Yes, that's true. I think they had a very good working relationship. In fact, some of the narratives talk about, one narrative I found by the name of the forester was Lippincott.
Okay.
Who's from San Francisco, and he describes the moment in the Oval Office when
They're in the Oval Office?
They're in the Oval Office. Lippincott is standing there with Theodore Roosevelt, and this is Ranger Lippincott with Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot. And Roosevelt turns to Pinchot and said, "Should I sign it?" And Pinchot said, "Yes, go ahead." And what it was the damming of the Hetch Hetchy.
Oh.
Which became, it's tremendously controversial still.
Wow.
Absolutely. But as I like to say, without the damming of that Hetch Hetchy, they understood that San Francisco had no water at the time or needed a second reservoir.
Okay.
Some other way to get water. Now, a lot of the Sierra Club would still argue about this, and rightly so. There's ample reason to find fault and opportunity either way.
Right,
Yep.
right. So has technology been a good or a bad thing for the Forestry Service? Or does it even impact it?
Oh,
Somehow
very.
you think, my iPhone in a tree? I don't know.
Well, I think, it depends on at which desk you sit.
I see. Okay.
And I think so many of the foresters, unfortunately, are at desks now, and Pinchot
Not out in the field.
Not out in the field watching, and in touch with the land as much as they might. Now, Pinchot knew that foresters were always responsible to Congress.
Okay.
So keeping exact notes and records was part of their job.
So Congress does have input into this and control over it.
Oversight.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
So that's
It always did and always will.
okay.
Yeah.
So the Forestry Department now is part of the Department of Interior, correct?
No, it's under the Department of Agriculture.
Oh, Agriculture. Why did I think it was Interior?
Well, the Forest Service has always been thought of as the like farmers. They're managing a crop. So that's under agriculture.
Trees.
Right. And,
Okay.
and Gifford Pinchot wanted to keep it under agriculture.
Okay.
Yes, not under interior.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it is still there today.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Interior is Park Service.
The Ballinger affair was something else that I was reading about in your notes. What was that? That sounds...
Well, I'm not a expert on the Ballinger controversy, but it was what led to Gifford Pinchot's removal
Yeah.
as chief.
Okay.
In early 1910, late 1909, 1910.
Okay.
There was tremendous controversy.
This was a political fight.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it was a natural resource fight. So
Right.
there was controversy over the leasing of Alaska coal lands.
Oh.
And
okay.
I think Pinchot put himself in an almost impossible situation. And he was dismissed for, I think it was insubordination.
Okay.
Was the final call. And but I think that in the end he would say, he said the fight was on after that point. So his dismissal allowed him to operate in a different capacity as a true conservationist.
Okay.
Because under the rubric of, or under his as wearing the hat of the forester, chief forester, he was required to, of course, produce as much of the natural resource for the United States to create as much coal as possible. But he also recognized that created its own problems when one is over extracting.
Yeah.
That's not the exact details of this situation.
Now, is conservation as controversial today as environmental issues are, or do they mesh together somehow?
Well, I think conservation is the big umbrella.
Okay.
So under conservation, we might think about recycling, or we might think of water purity, or how we keep fresh water coming through our tap. But there's
like Flint.
Like Flint, like so many places
Yes.
now. I mean, we've got most serious water issues in the country. We're finding out from Florida every day just the difficulty in maintaining an aquifer. And in many parts of the United States, the underground is connected. This is what people, I think, they like to say, okay, well, we're just going to drill a well.
Here, right.
But underneath that, you ask any well digger, and they have to understand what's happening.
Connects to everything else that's under there.
Yes.
Huh, okay.
Yes, it's all connected.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
Yes.
So your book, which I will highly recommend people read, is noted as volume 1. Are you planning more volumes?
I am. We are, I should say. So this is volume 1.
Okay.
And so there were 224 letters, and this contains about 11 letters.
Wow.
I know. So theoretically, we could be,
Keep going for years.
keep going for years. But I think there'll probably be, in the end, about 10 volumes.
I want to thank Bibi for her time and for sharing her experiences and her expertise. For reasons that I still don't entirely understand, conservation seems to be controversial in some circles. I keep thinking about what Gifford Pinchot wrote when he said, "Without natural resources, life itself would be impossible." At the present, the U.S. has over 188 million acres of national forest managed by the Forest Service, which is now still an agency, as you mentioned, of the Department of Agriculture. We can only hope that as a nation, we realize the value of maintaining our natural resources. I would encourage all of our viewers to get a copy of Gifford Pinchot and the Old Timers, and don't just read it, but continue to champion the work started by the Old Timers. Thank you.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.